Thank you very much, Sarah, and hello, everybody. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to the conference today. My name is Michael Barron. My background is not in the mining sector, and I'm not a geologist. My background is in the oil and gas sector, so a different type of raw materials. I worked for BG Group for many years, particularly on transparency issues. And before we kick off, I'll just let Tim briefly introduce himself as well.
Yeah, thanks very much. So as Sarah said, my background is with Anglo. Neither am I a geologist or material scientist. I'm a chartered accountant, but background as a tax expert. So I was in the tax team for Anglo, responsible for tax transparency and tax reporting and governance and reputation stuff globally for the Anglo group. But since then, been working on a lot of projects in conjunction with Michael in this kind of transparency space, particularly focusing at the moment on beneficial ownership, which we're going to talk about today in the context of responsible raw materials. But I'll hand back to Michael to kick things off.
Yeah, so Tim and I together have come up with this framework, BO6, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it really is about kind of knowing who is responsible, and as Sarah has already said, kind of complements the previous presentation by Jeff, and probably some of the other work we're doing, other talks in this conference. So what we'd like to do is start off by moving on to the next slide. And I think we kind of, when we're talking about responsible raw materials, and so what are, just briefly, what are responsible raw materials? And we can all say it's all about, you know, minimizing environmental impact, or even having a beneficial impact on the environment, having beneficial impacts on society, and minimizing the adverse impacts on the social fabric. And more importantly, and the bit that maybe gets less emphasis in this context, the G of ESG, good governance, the decision making and monitoring, and the rules by which minerals are and raw materials are extracted, produced, supplied, and consumed. So we're also, Tim and I was thinking, not just what are responsible raw materials, but therefore what are irresponsible raw materials. And I think, again, it's that there's some quite clear consensus about this. It's obviously processes and activities that damage the environment, damage the social fabric, and poor governance. But also, I think it's something that's slightly beyond that, which is also the balance and equal importance. And any project or any activity that also fails to give environment, society, and governance kind of equal importance could also be have concerns about the level of responsibility, or be classed as irresponsible. And it is about, and in this context, it's about the failure to give governance due attention, which could also lead to a major crisis, major reputational damage, increased pressure and scrutiny, just as significant for environmental risk, environmental crisis, or social crisis. So if your project or your company gets entangled through procurement or some other process in allegations of corruption, money laundering, conflicts of interest, that could cause modern slavery, is the example that Jeff gave just now. This it could have as much of an impact, and you'd be seen as irresponsible as whether you've, major environmental damage or major adverse impact on a local community or society. And so that's the kind of prism through which we want to see, and the role that a beneficial ownership can play in the governance space and ensuring good governance around raw materials. So with that, I will hand on to Tim.
Thanks, Michael. And I think, as Michael said, it's in the context of that G, the governance piece, that we're going to focus on the concept of ultimate beneficial ownership and beneficial ownership transparency, and the role that plays in responsible minerals. My son's former physics teacher would say to him, if it gets tricky, draw a picky. So in that vein, I'm going to use a diagram to try and explain some of the concepts here, because I appreciate that not everybody will be familiar with exactly what ultimate beneficial ownership really means. So let's start off by considering that we have a company which appears to be behaving responsibly and has all those kind of good hallmarks that suggests that it's considering the E, the S, and the G. And we know who that company's parent company is, and they again appear to be behaving in a responsible manner. But then sitting above that parent company, there may well be a complex ownership structure, and that could involve lots of offshore ownership of companies. It could have trusts, it could have bearer shares, it could have all sorts of instruments that mask who the people ultimately behind that company are and what their interests are. So we don't really know what's up there above that. But I'll let you into the secret, which is that one of the interested parties in this structure is, let's say, a prominent politician, possibly one who has an interest in the sector, and may or may not have an interest locally in the country where the operations are. And maybe another interested party at the top of the list is an individual who's on a sanctions list. And I guess the question is, does that then cause a problem for the company at the bottom of the chain? Well, it may do. The sanctions list one probably does. The prominent politician may or may not do, depending on who that politician is and what their role is and where they sit. But at the very least, what this should do is raise some red flags for you. And I think the question for the company at the bottom, I mean, the company at the bottom may not be a company that is here on this call, and I'm not suggesting that it would be. But what about if that company at the bottom is your customer? What about if the company at the bottom is your supplier? And in that situation, then knowing who the ultimate beneficial owners are of that company is relevant in terms of raising red flags over your relationship with that company. Now, most companies already do this to some extent. So they will have customer and supplier due diligence processes. In fact, back in 2018, BHP announced that they were putting together a register of the beneficial ownership of every company in their supply chain, which is over 15,000 suppliers, for their own benefit, in order for them to understand the risk associated with that. But the risks go beyond that. And referring back to Jeff's presentation, that may be about local procurement. What is local procurement, and how do you meet those local procurement rules? And does that require you to understand really who it is that you're dealing with? Is it really is the local company really just a front for something which isn't local? It also is about relevant to identifying corruption, conflicts of interest. Are you dealing with a company which ultimately is a front for a politically exposed person in the country where you're operating? And does that itself potentially bring you into areas of risk, as Michael referred to, that you weren't necessarily aware of? So I think this gives kind of a picture, first of all, of what we mean by ultimate beneficial ownership. We mean those people who are benefiting from or controlling a company. In the mining sector, that's already recognized as being important, and that's why beneficial ownership is part of the EITI standard. But that only applies to beneficial ownership of those companies which are holding licenses or exploring for minerals or oil and gas. It doesn't extend to the supply chain or businesses elsewhere in the economy. So I think where this sits is that the risk extends beyond just understanding the beneficial ownership of companies in the extractive sector. It's also those who are dealing with companies in the extractive sector need to understand the risks that they're suppliers and customers potentially bring. So understanding ultimate beneficial ownership, I mean, it's one of the pillars of good governance. It is part of the risk management and risk mitigation of commercial activities of businesses in not just the extractive sector, but here we're talking about the extractive sector. It's about knowing who you're doing business with. It's about knowing ultimately who your suppliers, contractors, partners, and in some cases competitors are. And it's also about governments understanding who the businesses are that are operating in their country. So who ultimately is benefiting from and owns the extractives companies or their major suppliers operating in a country, and are they local businesses? Are they ultimately owned locally? Or are they potentially owned in jurisdictions which are higher risk, some of which we've obviously talked about earlier today. There is a global trend towards greater beneficial ownership disclosure and transparency. We've seen that in EITI over recent years. The Financial Action Task Force has recommendations that countries look to meet on beneficial ownership, which apply economy-wide. And the EU has also done a lot of work on beneficial ownership transparency, with EU member states required to have public registers of beneficial ownership in place for all companies listed in there, or all companies registered in their jurisdictions. But there isn't a global standard for beneficial ownership transparency. There are various different sort of benchmarks, if you like, but there isn't a single standard. And that in itself causes some issue with the design and implementation phases. But what is clear is that there is a use case on the private sector side, and that's what we've seen from that diagram. Coming on to BO6, which Michael alluded to earlier. So this is the framework, and this is intended for assisting governments in the design and implementation of a beneficial ownership regime. And what it does is it navigates government through 6 stages, through from understanding to then benefiting from the implementation of a beneficial ownership regime. So what do we mean by each of these steps? So understand is about understanding the landscape in which the beneficial ownership regime is being constructed. Each country starts from a different place. It starts from a different place in terms of the shape of the economy, in terms of the risks associated with not understanding beneficial ownership, but also in terms of the level of information which is already available about companies. The next stage is decide. So that's a country deciding on the scope of the beneficial ownership reporting regime it wants to put in place. And that includes critical decisions around what beneficial ownership means. How do you define a beneficial owner? Which sorts of companies are in scope? Do you have a threshold of ownership which determines that somebody is a beneficial owner? Those kind of technical questions. The next stage is design. So that's designing how you're going to collect beneficial ownership information, store it, most importantly, verify it. One of the biggest challenges with beneficial ownership registers is the quality of data in those registers. So verification of data is a very important stage. And then how that information is disclosed and how you enforce the regime. The 4th step is legislate. One of the biggest weaknesses in beneficial ownership transparency in the extractive world around EITI, for example, is that in a lot of cases, there is no legal obligation for companies to disclose their beneficial owners. Along with everything else in EITI, it is down to the local EITI Secretariat to influence companies to disclose that information. A robust and economy-wide beneficial ownership regime really needs to be rooted in a legal obligation to disclose. Implementation. This ranges from the sort of IT implementation, systems design, how are you going to collect the data and where are you going to store it, through to the training and awareness raising aspects, and how do you actually make sure that companies know what they need to disclose, and also, just as importantly, if you have a public register, that companies understand how they can use that information. And that leads on to the final one, which is benefit. So making sure that the country benefits from the work that's been done to develop a beneficial ownership reporting regime. That means governments benefiting from understanding the companies that are operating in their country and using that information to tackle corruption, money laundering, the financing of terrorism or other illicit financial flows, but also for businesses to be able to benefit from it in terms of understanding who they're doing business with. I'll pass back to Michael. Oh, you're still muted, Michael.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, so slight technical issue there. And so kind of final stage of this is what can you as a company or as either in the extractive sector, in the raw materials business, as an advisor involved in this in some way, what can you do about it? And also what can governments or government should do about this? And I think there are several things. One, obviously, is advocate for beneficial ownership registers in countries where you operate. So there are quite a few countries, the EU member states, the UK and others, where they have beneficial ownership registers, but there are a lot of countries which are still thinking about it. They want to do it in terms of to meet their FATF obligations, the Financial Action Task Force obligations, or because they're under pressure, because the EU is a major trading partner. There are drivers for this. But governments often erroneously see this just as imposing another burden on business and think business will be opposed to it. And actually, it's not such, it shouldn't be such a huge burden on business. Reporting your beneficial ownership does require a bit of effort, but it is a fairly minimal burden, and many companies have to know who their beneficial ownership owners are anyway in order to meet KYC requirements when they go to their banks or insurance providers and so forth. And actually there is a public good in this, especially where beneficial ownership registers are public. You spend a little, as a company, you spend a little bit of time submitting your beneficial ownership information to a registry, but you get back the whole information. You have access to all the information in the register. So for example, in the UK, you go onto the Companies House website and for free interrogate the Companies House website database and find out the beneficial ownership of companies you're thinking of doing business with, or your suppliers, or even your competitors. And that leads on to the second point, really, which is where there are registers available, make use of them, maximize use of them. Again, in the UK example, Companies House have done their own research, which shows that one of the biggest user groups of their database is small and medium-sized enterprises, exactly at doing it for due diligence purposes, because they can't afford expensive consultants who charge tens of thousands of pounds or dollars for investigating or conducting due diligence on suppliers and vendors. And the third bit is understand the risks in your supply chain. Who are the companies that potentially raise red flags? How much do you really know about them? Are they based or in countries which earlier this morning were deemed untrustworthy or you have concerns about? Are they in countries which are on EU or FATF watch lists? Those sorts of, so really understand the risks on supply chain from the governance angle and the risks of inadvertently getting entangled in allegations of corruption, money laundering, conflicts of interest, and those sorts of governance related risks. And for governments, what they can do is demonstrate their commitment to open and trustworthy business environments through and implementing a public beneficial ownership register as part of that. Governments are often reluctant to talk about sensitive issues like money laundering, corruption, but there is a flip side, a positive side, and this is the way Tim and I usually approach this, is that actually this is also about the integrity of the business environment. It's about a more open and competitive business environment, and countries are in competition with one another for investment, for your procurement dollars or your investment dollars, and they can go a long way to helping build trust and the integrity of their business environment through a beneficial ownership reporting regime. And I will end my remarks there and happy to take questions or discuss any aspect of this.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Michael and Tim. A massive round of applause from all of us on the other side of our muted microphone. So thank you very, very much for that. Just time for one very quick question on this. So this comes in from Amanda, and she asks, what do you do when companies are set up in countries without transparent reporting regimes?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the issue that beneficial ownership transparency is trying to address. At the end of the day, if you have real concerns about the ownership of a country, ownership of a company, and where it's based, I mean, the first thing to do is do your own due diligence. Ask the company itself. If they are reluctant to disclose their ownership details, that should be a red flag in itself. And then it comes down to a management judgment on whether you're happy to do business with that company. You can use a certain amount of publicly available resources to get so far. In the end, if the supplier or the company is important enough to you, is big enough to you, is material enough to you, it may be worth spending some money with a due diligence provider to dig into the background. But the point is, as beneficial ownership registers become more prevalent around the world, there should be less and less hiding places for companies who are determined to obscure their ownership. And any kind of bad actor, any determined bad actor, will find loopholes, even in the kind of the UK or the EU beneficial ownership registers. But yes, I mean, do your own due diligence, ask the company itself, and at the end of the day, it's a judgment call.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to that, obviously, to the extent that the company itself is operating in a country which has a register, if its ownership is in a less transparent regime, that should be disclosed in the company's register. So, for example, Michael and I worked on designing the regime in Ghana. If you are a company, a Ghanaian company, you have to disclose your beneficial ownership, even if those beneficial owners are in a country which does not have any kind of transparency on ownership. You have to disclose in the Ghanaian register the ultimate beneficial owners that sit at the very top of that list. I've seen there's a couple of other questions, Sarah. One of those I will answer with a link.
So just on that, we're now running 10 minutes behind, which is 50% behind, unfortunately. So what I'm going to do, Tim, is if you want to answer those questions in chat, that would be awesome.
Absolutely.
But then I also know that Amanda and yourselves are all going to be in the closing panel session. So
Excellent.
we can bring some of them into the panel. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for a round of applause for Tim and Michael. Thank you very much.